years ago, Dun Bradstreet launched its Top 500 publication. A couple of years after that, we also launched our flagship event, which we call the Corporate Awards. This year we have our 19th year of publication and 13th year of the awards, where we celebrate the achievements of the top 500 companies in the country. Let me give a little bit of context as to where these 500 companies sit within the economy. About 20% of the GDP comes out of defense, the bureaucracy, and farmers. The remaining 80% comes out of the revenues of approximately 81 million public and private enterprises, about 81 million. Obviously, the top 500 companies are the largest out of this 81 million. Let's see how they sit within the overall global economy. If the top 500 companies were a separate economy, they would be about 25th. So they would be sandwiched somewhere between Thailand and Belgium. So that's how big they would be if they were a separate country in their own right. And if they continue to grow the way they're growing, they would reach the top 10 by 2030. So in terms of absolute significance, they're actually pretty large. If you track the evolution and their ability to maintain their relative position within the top 500, you start with 500 companies in the year 2000. Interestingly, within 24 months, only about 400 of the 500 actually remained within the top 500. By the time you reached about year 12, less than half the top 500 actually remained within the 500 largest companies 12 years on. Interestingly, that kind of drop in terms of relative presence is not confined only to the cohort of 2000. Exactly the same applies to the cohort of 2005 and then 2010. If I look at the companies that were in our 2010 top 500, we're already down to roughly 314 that remain in the top 500. So their ability to stay within the cohort that they're in is actually quite limited. It's a challenging space to be in. It would be instructive to see how our large companies compare with the large companies of other countries, right? So what we've done is we've tracked the Fortune Global 500 and we've seen what the country contributions into the Fortune Global 500 are, right? And we've tracked that over from 2005 all the way up to 2018. Right? As you'd expect, the US was always the largest contributor. It remains the largest contributor, right? So it used to have about 176 companies within the Global 500. And that 176 has now come down to 126, right? So still pretty impressive, even though about 50 companies have dropped out, right? However, companies from China, for example, right? It used to be only 16. And over the 13 years from 2005 onwards, China has now got 111. So that's a pretty impressive growth by any account, right? Now, if you compare that with India, India used to have 5, which was relatively modest in 2005, and we now have 7, which remains relatively modest, even though our GDP has doubled during that time period. So the question is why? Why is it that Indian world-beating companies are so hard to come by? What's interesting is that our economists and our research team have quantified what we probably know already. And the 3 things are, firstly, we need to do a lot to improve entrepreneurship in the country. The second thing is, we need to promote what are known as high growth companies, which have a very strong relation to labor productivity. And the third thing is we need to strengthen our institutions. Improving entrepreneurship. If you tracked an entrepreneurship index, countries like US, Switzerland, Netherlands, they're all sitting up there at the higher end of the S curve. India, as you'd expect, is at the lower end of the S curve. China, interestingly, has kind of caught the high trajectory part of the S curve. So if you look at how we sit, India really has a long way to go, with about 1% contribution of companies in the top 500. The second is what's known as high growth firms. There's a very interesting piece of research that's been done by the OECD and the World Bank. And what you see is that they've come across an expression called high growth firms, and they define high growth firms as those companies that have a minimum of 3 consecutive years of 20% growth or better. A lot of the developed countries don't have a high percentage of companies that are high growth firms. But if you look at the emerging economies, right, you have obviously very high percentages. You've got, companies like Turkey and Brazil are at the sort of 20% of their companies are high growth firms. India, unfortunately, is only about 6%. And why that's significant is that high growth firms and labor productivity are very closely connected with each other. That's what the research shows. The third thing that we need to do is to have much stronger institutions. There is a very strong correlation between institutions and the strength of the institutions as measured by an index that has been developed by the GEDI and the GCI and Transparency International. As you'd expect, you have a very clean line where all the countries sit. Interestingly, in that line, India is not doing so bad. In terms of strength of institutions, we're actually doing quite well. In terms of corruption index, we're not doing as well as we should. So we're roughly on that line, a little bit better in terms of institutions than corruption. But we need to get still better. We're kind of halfway where we need to be. There's a whole lot of knock-on effects for the medium-sized companies and the small companies and the micro companies. So there are a lot of forward and backward linkages. There are a lot of benefits of improved competition. There's a lot of partnership that happens through the large companies with the smaller companies. So all of this put together is very, very important for the economy.